Hi, this is Councilmember Mitch O'Farrell, representing the 13th District. I am delighted to introduce today's launch episode of Civitas, LA, Reimagining Hollywood's Main Street, Hollywood Boulevard. We are excited to share the Heart of Hollywood initiative and its signature project, the Walk of Fame Master Plan, an initiative that centers on people, a collaborative community process, and innovative urban design, which seeks to reimagine and enhance one of the world's most iconic corridors. Congratulations to the Civitas LA team, produced right here in Hollywood, for this great civic initiative.
Welcome to Civitas LA, where we feature diverse and emerging leaders who make up this dynamic region and are creating community every day and building a better tomorrow. Each week, we hear from, learn from, and are inspired by a new generation of civic entrepreneurs who are forging a path forward and making LA a stronger, more resilient, and connected group of citizens. Now more than ever, we aim to foster community connections, promote civic discourse, and elevate civic knowledge and engagement and participation across the greater Los Angeles region while elevating emerging voices in this civic conversation. Cities are ever evolving, and communities and spaces within communities are forever being reimagined. And with COVID-19, the global pandemic is also influencing how cities reshape themselves, and this is true here in Los Angeles as well. In the heart of Los Angeles, the community of Hollywood has been undergoing tremendous change and revitalization over the past number of years, attracting billions of dollars in new investment. And as private capital has returned, significant public investment is also being made in the region. Launched in the fall of 2018 under the leadership of Councilmember Mitch O'Farrell, representing the 13th District, the Heart of Hollywood initiative was launched. This is an initiative aimed at driving economic growth, fostering community, and really redesigning and reimagining the urban landscape in a way that balances the needs of pedestrians and commuters. In December of that year, Dan Halden, longtime field deputy for Councilmember O'Farrell, became the director of the Heart of Hollywood initiative. And over the last 2 years, Dan has worked with Lee Wen of Gensler, the global design and architecture firm engaged by the city, to oversee this master plan work. So with us today, we are absolutely delighted to have Dan Halden, who's calling in, and Lee Wen, who's here with us in the studio from Gensler. Dan, Lee, welcome.
Thank you very much, Dwayne.
Great to be here.
Well, glad to have you both. I really appreciate this. You know, we're going to start by really just referencing a couple of articles I know we shared back and forth a few weeks ago. And certainly during this pandemic, there have been a lot of articles that talk about how cities that were undergoing transformation, particularly some of the large cities like Seattle, San Francisco, New York, Boston, LA, but also looking at how these cities may be reimagined in a post-COVID-19 world. Wired magazine in particular had an article about the COVID-19 reshaping cities, and certainly this Heart of Hollywood master plan sort of may fit into that dialogue. Lee, do you have any thoughts with regards to this particular article, or how you feel the global pandemic may spur Hollywood on or spur LA on in terms of reimagining?
Well, I think, a city like Los Angeles, and unlike actually, let's say, Chicago and New York, is actually quite decentralized, both geographically, but also in how it actually structures its political system. I mean, we're basically run through the council districts, and we have a lot of, we have a very democratic, sort of almost pluralistic sort of culture. So any sort of change that happens, and I think change obviously needs to happen on many levels, but even urbanistically is always going to go through sort of stages. I think what we've tried to do in looking and reshaping the vision for the future of the Walk of Fame is to understand where those thresholds might be on the evolution to change and make sure that the plan can actually accommodate all those different steps so that we can get from A to D, but we have to consider B, C as well. And so that, I think, is a more inclusive sort of way of looking at master planning for an urban city as opposed to wholesale change. I think we all, many cities have felt the pains of, let's say, wiping the slate clean, a la urban renewal from the 1960s, and that certainly left a lot of scars, as opposed to an evolution that is based on maybe a series of smaller revolutions.
Thanks, Lee. Dan, do you want to add to that?
Sure. I think it's very interesting, and Lee knows this, and a lot of the Hollywood community that we've been working with for basically the better part of a year at this point around the heart of Hollywood and what the Walk of Fame master plan should be. But I think it's really interesting that when we released the concept plan in January, the kind of the big idea that it revolved around, and it's right in there in the concept plan, is this notion that the street is a place for everyone, and that we needed to rethink Hollywood Boulevard specifically, which is a place, one of the few places in the world that, at some point or another, somehow or another, literally everybody comes to, but that we needed to take a step forward and rethink it as a place where, frankly, there's just more space for people and more space for people to feel good and to be with one another. And we certainly were not anticipating a pandemic, but some of the things that we've been talking about now for a year, like sidewalk dining and space for gathering, for people outside, are things now, because of what's going on in our current situation. I feel really good about that. We've already established that as a marker for where we want to go anyway. So, sometimes things have a way of evolving, and you just kind of go from there.
Sure, and I think we talked about another article that appeared in the Guardian newspaper, which looked at how infectious diseases have really shaped urbanism. Whether it was the outbreak of cholera in London, the creation of wider paved roads, as well, the yellow fever outbreak in Philadelphia around the turn of the 20th century, and how these really shaped those cities. I'm wondering, there have been a number of articles that talk about, perhaps people will, decamp from New York because it's so dense. How do you think this will, reshape the civic conversation here in Los Angeles? Because, I know there are a number of organizations who continue to fight the quote-unquote Manhattanization of LA and the Manhattanization of Hollywood. I'm wondering how we think this pandemic may evolve local operating systems here in Los Angeles.
Well, I think, before, during, and after the pandemic, a lot of our major needs, and certainly in our office and for Councilmember O'Farrell, what have been our longtime priorities, like housing and affordable housing and pedestrian safety and our urban canopy, our tree canopy and stuff like that. Those were our priorities before. They are certainly going to remain our priorities even more so moving forward. I do think that the pandemic has supercharged this discussion on a larger level, though, in various things. Like I mentioned, how do we support our businesses with something like sidewalk dining, or just, being able to use the public right of way for more usable space that is designed around people? How do we get people enjoying the fresh air, or what we hope is fresh air? And frankly, and this has been well documented, when people are driving less, lo and behold, the air is cleaner. We actually introduced a motion, or Councilmember O'Farrell introduced a motion a couple months ago that wants to look at incentives for businesses to, even when we're through the pandemic, or can we look at offering any kinds of incentives for businesses, at least partially, maybe one day a week or even more than that, having folks work from home and continuing to remotely commute, just because we recognize some of the positive effects that it can have on the environment. So I think in those areas, we will probably see an ongoing evolution. It certainly has moved, I think, a conversation forward about the necessity of some of those things.
Lee, do you want to add to that?
I think what Dan said earlier is very true. It's something that he and I very much have talked about and agree on, which is that the street is for everybody, which, you could look at the street as being sort of the last democratic sort of public space, or at least the primary public democratic space we have in the city. And I think, in LA in particular, which has always traditionally been not as pedestrian oriented as, let's say, other cities that we may speak of, that maybe have older heritages of being pedestrian oriented. The street has really become, until recently, recently being that it's kind of empty right now, but a contested space between vehiculars, now scooters, obviously people, bicycles, skateboarders. And so the question is, has the balance tipped that we need to provide more space for, say, ultimate forms of mobility beyond just the car, which is primary? And I do think that, the decamping part, that's going to, whether it happens or not, it's going to be driven by things more than urban planning. I think that when I look at the city now, it's a situation where many people are actually realizing they took for granted many of the things they were able to do before the pandemic, which is basically gather. And so I could see this evolving in sort of two ways on a parallel track. Some people may leave the city and go, let's say, to the suburbs, and I think the suburbs need to be re-examined. For a very long time, they're pretty much dependent on cities for the workforce. They don't actually exist unless they're next to a city. That's the whole definition of a suburb. But there used to be this model where you actually had urban villages that had their own main street, their own town squares, and they had their own sense of civic identity that wasn't dependent on the city that they were serving, but was codependent on each other as opposed to being dependent. Likewise, I think in the city, as people try and gather more for community, the idea of having parks and more open space, wider sidewalks, things like that, I think there will be an urge for that, I think, because people now realize how great it was to be able to get together, and they're going to be hopefully wanting to do it more, which is going to make a demand for that kind of space. So when we're looking at, let's say, the master plan for the Walk of Fame specifically, widening the sidewalks also means bringing in more landscape, bringing more shade trees, so that the people who are sitting on the sidewalk don't get burned. I mean, literally. Areas maybe for other kinds of neighborhood recreations, so that the street now becomes a community space. And as LA starts to densify, and not necessarily mean, I know when people think densification, they're thinking like big housing towers, but even just mid-sized 5 to 6 story buildings. I don't think the single family dwelling is ever going to go away from LA. It's the legacy of LA's sort of residential stock, but sort of mid-rise as well as high-rise housing, with it needs to come open community spaces, whether they're parks or plazas, so the city can actually breathe. Right now, most of the open spaces in LA are on its fringes, whether it's Griffith Park or the beach or the Santa Monica Mountains, and you have to get in your car and you have to drive there to hike. I mean, the fact that Runyon Canyon has valet service, I think, says everything that you need to know. So if we could actually have, if LA is decentralized and we're very proud of our sort of cluster of sort of different neighborhoods, why don't all those neighborhoods actually have parks and parks within the housing part? All you got to do is go to London. Every residential district there is built around a park. And I think those sorts of things helps to relieve the stress and allow the streets as well as our neighborhoods to breathe more and provide the type of community opportunities that don't exist now, that get crammed on the streets. So we're hoping that by relieving the pressure on Hollywood Boulevard, we can at least begin to start looking at our cities in a new way.
Well, that's great, because I know, Lee, when you and I had the opportunity to co-chair the Hollywood Economic Development Committee, we had very intentional sessions around the value of open space in terms of attracting development and how those were important to building community. So that's very, very intentional work. So let's go right to the specifics of the Heart of Hollywood project itself. For those who may not be as familiar with it, I know Dan has been doing a lot of work. So Dan, can you just give the audience an overview of the Heart of Hollywood initiative first of all?
Sure. So basically what it is it is our offices, and specifically on behalf of our office and on behalf of Councilmember O'Farrell, it's our full-time focus on the historic core of Hollywood, mostly the Walk of Fame, not necessarily just the Walk of Fame, but really, that area of Hollywood and Hollywood Boulevard in particular, that area between Highland Avenue and Vine Street. Those folks who are residents or who are familiar with Hollywood will know that that half a mile-ish or so from Highland to Vine is where the bulk of our nationally registered historic district is. From a Walk of Fame, or just like public works kind of sidewalk standpoint, it's also the area that is. It's also the area where the Walk of Fame, in many cases, is in the most disrepair. If you think of Hollywood Boulevard, like a dumbbell, so to speak. You've got the cluster and the transit stop around Hollywood and Highland, and that's an area that everybody knows because of movie premieres and all of the things that happen there. And then you have Hollywood and Vine on the other side, and that iconic intersection with Capitol Records and the hills in the background. And then you have the area in between, which really has the great opportunity, I think, to be that connector between the two. So my focus is really full-time on that area, whether it is the Walk of Fame Master Plan project and this big public investment, or what is at the foundation of everything that I always do anyway, which is community engagement and trying to elevate not just the quality of life, but the sense of community and the civic engagement within that area and for that area, which is why I've tried to really, really, really focus on relationships with stakeholder organizations, individual residents, residential buildings, properties, businesses, and we host a series of roundtables and all of that kind of stuff. So it's all about making that area really strong, really connected, elevating the quality of life and experience for all of the different users that it has.
No, I appreciate that. I'm going to talk about community engagement in a little bit, but I wanted to ask you and ask Lee, from a design, from a flow, from that perspective, how does Hollywood Boulevard work or not work? Certainly, I know from some it's perceived as a very touristy area. Give me your thoughts on Hollywood Boulevard as it currently exists.
So we did some analysis of this that we started off in our conversations with Dan once we had secured the project, and analyzed sort of main streets in terms of how they are serving the community and what are, shall we say, the metrics that are actually allowing that to happen. So we looked at the Ramblas in Barcelona, which is an old historic street. We looked at Nanjing Road in Shanghai, which is a very new street, but it's actually an old street that now has been converted. We looked at sort of the iconic, Champs-Élysées, okay, and others as well. And one of the things Oxford Street in London, one of the things they all had in common was the percentage of sidewalk space to car space, which was 70% sidewalk space and 30% width. And if we talk about the width from building face to building face, 70% sidewalk space for people and 30% space for cars. On Hollywood Boulevard, as it stands right now in the stretch that Dan is talking about, it's exactly the inverse of that. It's 70% car space width for car space and 30% for people. So one of the very early sort of, shall we say, ideas that we kind of lynched onto was to invert that, and how could we do that? To use successful examples in other places as a way to be able to help guide our design thinking. And then how do we actually get there in a way that might be even more accommodating beyond that? Because, obviously there are a lot of opinions about streets in LA. You mentioned the two articles about let's close down the streets. Certainly there are folks in LA and interest groups in LA who believe Hollywood Boulevard should just be shut down completely to cars. Okay, and that may happen one day. Some may want it sooner, some may want it right away. There are others who are much more traditional and say you can't take away any cars at all. We got to keep it that way. You can't take away the parking spaces because retailers on Hollywood Boulevard actually want the cars to be ease of parking right in front of the store. But there's plenty of statistics, and there was one by ULI in San Francisco where a stretch, and I forget which street it was, where they actually did take away other parking and increase the pedestrian sort of sidewalk width, and the business actually went up because you had more space for people to actually walk along, because you don't see a 25, 30-foot wide storefront when you're driving at 25, 35 miles an hour. You might see a shopping mall or a big box Target, but you don't see those store widths, which are part of the historic fabric, are based on the pace of how you walk, not how you drive. So if you actually make more feet on the street, you actually are going to improve your business. And so we were looking at that as well. The other thing we looked at was obviously traffic. Because people say, well, you can't take away the cars, it's a high traffic area. So, there are many studies to be done, but our preliminary studies based on the data that we were able to gather showed that actually Hollywood Boulevard is not actually as much a major artery. let's face it, it's not even that long. It goes from basically Laurel Canyon all the way down till it hits Vermont, as opposed to Sunset Boulevard, which goes all the way from downtown to the beach. So it actually has a certain sort of limitation in its length, which then also starts to reduce traffic. Now, obviously, special events, think nights at the, Hollywood Bowl, and things like that, opening premieres create special situations. So those have to be examined too. So and getting into specifics, our plan proposes to remove the parking spaces and remove one lane of traffic in each direction. So you have one lane in each direction with a middle turn lane, so that we can add another 16 to 20 feet of sidewalk on either side. Now, right now, we're trying to coordinate that with the existing utilities and all that sort of stuff, but the idea is to do that. The other thing that we also thought about, and this gets back to my earlier statement about making a master plan that can actually be implemented in stages, is to say, what can we do to actually heighten the presence and people's awareness of some of the cultural monuments along Hollywood Boulevard? So providing the ability to have flexible, shall we say, plazas that can be shut down, not for movie events, but actually for neighborhood or community events, whether it's the farmer's market or whether it's a foreign film festival on the street in the public. One could do that by having removable bollards at certain parts of the place, whether the obvious one is in front of the Groman's Chinese Theater and all that sort of stuff on Hollywood Highland, but how about one in front of the Pantages for an opening at the Pantages Theater? Or the Pacific Theater, which right now is in disrepair, but we can project to the future that it won't be since it's one of the cultural treasures on there, etc. Maybe one in front of Musso and Frank's and Maselli's, since those are the two of the most, shall I say, iconic restaurants along Hollywood Boulevard, two of the oldest. One in front of the Egyptian Theater. Now that Netflix has now become part of the programming along with the American Film Institute, that's another possibility. Now, these could be temporary, these could be periodic, it could be seasonal, but should the city decide to actually move more in that direction, they could be permanent too. So it provides flexibility for that possibility without imposing it. And I think that flexibility is important in a city that treasures choice as much as Los Angeles.
Sure. Well, I'm curious, you mentioned if the city chooses, so, Dan, you come to this from the
I mean, the population city, not just City Hall, but I don't know,
right.
Dan may disagree with me on that.
Right. But I'm curious to know from Dan's perspective, coming from the city perspective, how is this project being received by, City Hall and various departments of the city that you have to interact with? Is everyone behind this? Is this sort of a civic initiative just beyond the Council District 13?
I think so. I think that the response certainly that I've gotten, that we've gotten, that some of the ideas have gotten, and like the concept for the Walk of Fame master plan, have been overall received really positively. And it's been very interesting to go through this whole process, like with the community and with the project design team, and go like step by step by step. And now thinking about, it's been about 6 months since the concept and the big ideas were unveiled to the world. And, even through the pandemic, we're continuing to do as much engagement as we possibly can. But what's been interesting about the process from the start, and to answer your question, Dwayne, why I believe that overall it's been well received, is because whether you are a resident, a business, a tourist, or something related in any of the tourist industry, a property owner, whatever it is, whoever it is, whatever it is that you are, chances are you have some kind of a stake or connection to Hollywood, because just about everybody does. It's one of those 5 to 10, words or places that you could say to basically anybody in the world, and they're going to come in with some kind of instant connection to it, which is an amazing thing for a place to have. So everybody's got a connection to it, but there is, in my view, and not just working on this project for the past year and a half, but having worked in Hollywood for the past 6 years, I think that there is a commonly accepted understanding that, somehow, some way, this collective experience for all of us can be better. whether I am just using it as a thoroughfare to get from Laurel Canyon to Vermont and I'm in my car, or, I want to, hey, I live up in like Outpost Estates, or I live, within steps of the Walk of Fame, or I live on the Walk of Fame. I really love to be able to walk outside of my apartment or my house and feel like I could, kind of stay for a little bit longer and feel really good about it. And not just come, but come back. I've talked to many, many businesses that are on the boulevard over the years, particularly in the last year or so. And, when I say, okay, look, we want to make things better. We want to put this investment into your community. And, by and large, they say, great. So I think that there is this commonly accepted understanding that this community, which has to serve so many different needs, it is a main street for a neighborhood, as well as regionally, as well as nationally and internationally, I would argue. So it has a lot of different things that it has to do, but I think that is the really exciting opportunity because, for me as a public servant, for us, for Councilmember O'Farrell, it's just an opportunity to make this collective space better as an experience for everyone. And I think that is really something that most people are excited about and share as a goal.
Sure. Well, I know LA was the mayor was touting LA's tremendous success in getting, hitting the 50 million or so visitor mark of tourists, and I believe the numbers for Hollywood are in the neighborhood of 10 million or so. So clearly, we are a true beneficiary of global tourism and regional tourism, and a lot of people come to this particular boulevard. But of course, there's always been the challenges of the hills versus the flats. So I'm really curious to know how the challenges you have overcame in terms of reaching out to these different stakeholders, whether it was a property owner on the boulevard or folks in the hills who just passed through the boulevard, to get this sort of community consensus.
Well, we had a lot of good representation in our focus group sessions, as well as in a large community open house that we did last August 2019. And since I think September 2019, either in person or virtually, I have personally conducted a series of, I think we're now at 40 or 41 roundtable discussions with different stakeholders. So I am talking to and listening to people from different walks of life all the time. And one of the things that I love about our roundtables is that whether it's in person or virtually, the best scenario is when I have like make 4 or 5 or 6 people and we're sitting at a table, or we're sitting in the now iconic ubiquitous Zoom meeting, and we're all there looking at each other. And we're going through the ideas of the Walk of Fame master plan project or other related things that I've been working on or that we're doing, things like, signage or maybe some other things. And what's interesting when you have the resident, sitting next to like somebody who runs a nonprofit, sitting next to someone who runs a tour company, sitting next to, somebody else, and so on and so forth. What's interesting about that, and it sort of is validating because this has kind of been my hypothesis all along. What's interesting is you realize how much consensus there actually is, that there is this, again, this collective understanding and a collective desire, which, somehow, some way, I just intuitively know that, we could do X, Y, and Z, or we could do something to kind of just really elevate the experience that people have when they're here. And so again, I firmly believe that there is so much more in common in terms of what people want out of their experience on and with Hollywood Boulevard. Whether you're someone who is only using it as a commuter, or you're someone who lives right nearby and you're walking there every day, or you run a business, or whatever the case may be. I think everyone could benefit from a vision and the implementation of a vision that takes all of those different things and all of those different perspectives into account and moves forward broadly with consensus.
I think that's great, and I know Lee had a point that he wanted to raise as well. Lee?
Yeah, I mean, you had brought up this sort of what could be seen, I think, traditionally as a dichotomy between those, in, let's say, in Central Hollywood or the heart of Hollywood and the Hills. And I know, Dwayne, you and I have had these discussions before about Hollywood having a unique opportunity because of its geography that, that let's say downtown doesn't have, which is you have a lot of new companies coming in with a lot of young people in the entertainment districts, whether it's Viacom or Netflix or whatnot. And they're living in housing that's being built in Hollywood. And at some point, they're going to want a backyard, and they're going to want to raise their kids and maybe be in a house. And guess what? All they got to do is just go right up to the hill. No other place in LA actually has that kind of sort of urban density, sort of what young people tend to like more, to be able to be social, and also right next door. Even, yes, there's a freeway in between, but right next door pretty much are the Hollywood Hills. And I think that is changing, that sort of separation is changing because, one, we have more people who are living in heart of Hollywood, like myself. I live right on the boulevard. And that those people start to have agency in a place that was pretty much left for tourists and partiers, okay, up until maybe 10, 12 years ago, okay? Right. Those people are growing up there, and then they're moving on, and they can move on into the same neighborhood. I think Hollywood as a sort of civic leadership as well as business leadership needs to capitalize on that evolution and actually position Hollywood in terms of one of its most unique characters for people who live here. The tourists will never go away. Hollywood's mythology is vast. In fact, I know Dan, and I hope, Dan, you don't mind my paraphrasing one of the quotes you gave me, is that the space between the mythology of Hollywood and the reality of the Walk of Fame couldn't be bigger. And we're trying to close that gap with what we're doing, okay? So now instead of a street becoming maybe a divider, it's actually a street that actually sutures those two main parts of Hollywood together. And then let's not forget about East Hollywood too, with all the medical district, and how do we actually get that? So I mean, obviously the ideas of trying to put a cap park across the 101 freeway to try and suture across to East Hollywood. So there's all about trying to create connections between areas of LA that we have sort of traditionally seen as being separate and actually bind them together as one rich community, but with still diverse choices in terms of how you can live, how you can work, how you can play, how you can do your business.
Well, I know, in this post-COVID world, budgets, state budgets, county budgets, city budgets are just being really, really impacted. So it all comes down to resources. So I'm going to ask this question of you, Dan. What are the resource needs for a project like this to actually happen, and what are some of the timelines that you see for this project being implemented, and what does the ultimate outcome look like for the resident and the visitor?
We started this initiative with a little over $4 million in seed money that it was basically left over from the former CRA, or the Community Redevelopment Agency. Those people might remember, those were formed across the state, I think in like the mid to late 1980s. And in the last recession, the Great Recession, Governor Brown, when he took office, he disbanded those across the state. But there were some leftover resources from that that have to be spent within this immediate area, within the former redevelopment area. In Hollywood. Hollywood was the former CRA area. And as Lee knows, there are a lot of well-intentioned ideas and pieces of infrastructure that are all over the Walk of Fame and the public right-of-way that are kind of left over from the old CRA, but with no CRA or anybody to maintain it or to think through it all thematically. We've got a lot of stuff, lights, street furniture, pieces of the sidewalk that are just kind of been sitting there for quite a number of years. So anyway, we realized, or we thought, one thing that the Walk of Fame in particular has always been challenged by is the fact that it this unifying, cohesive, like thematic design element, design aesthetic, or therefore like experiential element. And we said, you know what, this is just the time. Like this, the Hollywood community really deserves this. Lee was mentioning. I do want to make a point, and the conversations that we had around this and the things that kind of popped up were really interesting. There's this notion that, oh, well, it's the Walk of Fame, so it's just a tourist area. And I would disagree with that in the sense of, first of all, there are a great number of people who live there and have lived there already, with more housing and affordable housing being built, and some of it new, some of it is still on the way. So there's that. There's also hundreds of businesses, local, Angelenos making their livelihood. It's not all just related to tourism. And I think that is very, very important to keep in mind and remember that, if you are someone who is living steps away from Hollywood Boulevard, ideally that's the main drag that is kind of functioning as your main street. And what I hear from a great number of residents over the years is that it doesn't always function that way. They'd like for it to function that way, but it doesn't always function that way. So that's just something that we certainly keep in mind. Mm-hmm. Regarding resources, going back to that, we started, like I said, with about a little over $4 million from the CRA money, and we are working our way through that. In terms of the ultimate cost of a lot of these things, I think it's still somewhat ultimately of a moving target, because we've finished the conceptual design phase. The project is now in schematic design, so Lee and the other members of the team, all the smart people, all the engineers, all the architects and everybody, they're all kind of we have to figure out the details. Like if our goals are this wider public space, and Lee mentioned what the proposal is, then we got to figure out the specifics of what exactly does that mean. So we have more study and analysis and specifics to dive into, which we will continue to dive into this year. What we are doing at the same time, though, is anticipating that ultimately, this is probably a very large public investment project, which the city does do from time to time. Two of the ones that come to mind for me are, and this is actually something that Councilmember O'Farrell spearheaded before he was the council member, the whole beautiful reinvestment of Echo Park Lake. That another community space that needed to be renovated and made better so that the community could utilize it better. Griffith Observatory was something that the city did about 15 or so years ago. So I kind of think of it, ultimately probably along those lines. What we're trying to do, though, what we are in the process of doing, while I continue to do all of my, outreach and talking to folks about it, while the team begins in earnest its work on schematic design, is go after different funding sources, grant opportunities that are available to projects of this nature. And there are different opportunities, whether they're at the county or the state or the federal levels, that provide cities or municipalities with resources for different kinds of projects. And the nice thing about the master plan is that it has, and actually there are 6 principles that are outlined within the concept plan. It's got a lot of priorities, and again, is designed to serve a bunch of different needs, whether it is active transportation and pedestrian orientation. There's money that is available from different sources for that. Whether it is economic development, there is different resources that are available for that, or infrastructure, or so on and so forth. So we are simultaneously trying to do a bunch of things, continue to engage with the community, continue to do all of that more technical work, while also building the package of resources that will allow us to implement this piece by piece, area by area, phase by phase over time.
So, if all went well, what's a reasonable timeline that, the neighborhood would begin to see, this work unfold before its very eyes? Is that, 2 years, 5 years? Do we look at this as,
Yeah, I think realistically, what would be ideal is to be in a place where, like, construction, and by the way, we have a long way to go before we ever get to that point. But, let's say we are able to successfully go through all of those steps, the schematic design and the other phases, that we've done all the study, we've figured out how everything would work, if there are going to be, traffic impacts and parking impacts, and how does that work, and all of those things. I would say, like, realistically, probably, within the next 3 years, to begin some, pretty significant construction. That's a reasonable goal.
And I know there was some conversation, because we're looking at Highland to Vine, that part of this would be done, looking at it in thirds. Or do you want to do the whole Highland to Vine all at one time, or is this going to be in pieces?
Probably most likely in pieces. And it depends on a number of factors. It depends on the resources that, hopefully are available, or that we're successful in making available. It depends on the community. It depends on, like, if there is to be a large construction project, and which, again, from time to time, including right now, there are across the city, whether it was one of the ones that I mentioned, or, all of the expansion that the Metro Rail has been doing in different areas over a number of years. You have a lot of different things that you have to factor in. I think probably the most realistic or reasonable thing to shoot for, like I said, is, something within the next few years to begin, and that it happens in geographical stages. With the caveat, of course, that at this point in time, there's a lot of things that are still in the works, and a lot of things that have to be figured out. But I do believe that we are capable of figuring all of those things out, and, delivering on something that's not going to take forever and ever and ever, and that we can manage, going through that as a neighborhood while we work to make it happen. And then, we're left with a product that makes things better for the community.
This is great, and I know, Dan, you mentioned the amazing outreach that you've done with community throughout this process. So tell us, for the audience, particularly those who are learning about this for the first time, how can they learn more about this initiative, and how can they become involved to support this initiative?
I am so glad you asked. So first things first, we have a website, which is heartofhollywood.la for Los Angeles, heartofhollywood.la, where all of this information lives, where the full 91-page Walk of Fame concept plan lives, where a survey that folks can take, and a number of people have, and that's also on the website. There are other things related to, Heart of Hollywood projects, like the Art Deco inspired wayfinding signs that were installed a little over a year ago. There's information on there about that. There's information on Hollywood history, and of course, how to contact us. So the first thing is, number one, I would recommend that everybody go to that website, take a look at the concept plan if you haven't already done that, and fill out the survey if you haven't already done that, because that's really valuable feedback for all of us to have. In addition to that, we're also really, really receptive to additional ways in which to engage. It's always about, trying to reach more people, and we always try to do it in a variety of ways. I mentioned, the focus groups and the open house and the roundtables that we do. We've also sent letters by mail to thousands and thousands of Hollywood residents. There are a whole bunch of people on my email list, that get my updates, or on social media. But we can always do better, always try to diversify that outreach, because, I truly, truly believe that there is a broad consensus that is waiting to be had. And I consider it my job as the main community liaison to really just kind of milk that and work with people and find out and figure out like what is what is the best thing that we can do that is going to achieve the most, like, of the highest percentage of the objectives and the needs and the desires of the community. So I think we've certainly tried to do a lot, and we'll keep doing that, but we're always interested in hearing from folks about additional ways that we can engage with them on this.
Yeah, I'd like to add something to that too, because I see the community engagement obviously from a different chair. I mean, Dan's been and his team have been really excellent at sort of gathering all the different entities in Hollywood that have have stake in this. Everybody from organizations like the Bid in the Chamber to all these neighborhood councils and other community and business members. And I will say, I've been practicing architecture in this city for 30 years, and I go in front of a lot of public hearings and things like that. Sometimes they can get quite contentious for the obvious reasons. I just want to say and share this with everybody, the audience here, which is I am, as a citizen of LA, as a resident in Hollywood, working on a project that is probably one of the most high-profile projects in Hollywood. Can't think of one that might be bigger, from a civic standpoint at least. I have been so pleasantly surprised about the cohesive, sort of positive response that I have witnessed. Now, Dan goes to a lot of meetings I don't go to, but the ones I've been a part of which have been probably, what do you think, Dan, about 20 of them, I would imagine, which is probably less than half of what you've been at. But, it's really incredibly slow. I mean, everybody from the Hills who you might think are like, we don't want anything happening here, you're going to bring more people, and the businesses, obviously, as Dan mentioned, the people who live there, the people who work there, the people who even, sort of have pedestrian sort of, advocacy and everything, they all see sort of the nature of how this could be better. And part of that is, to be fair, the Walk of Fame has sort of become a little bit more and more forlorn as each year kind of goes by. So it certainly needs the love, but I think everybody knows it can be better. And I think, there were some residents I met in the open house who said, we don't come down to Hollywood Boulevard because there's nothing here that interests us and it feels like not safe and all this sort of thing. But yeah, we'd love to come down here and see it as our main street, as Dan alluded to earlier. And I think that, just shows you sort of the power of sort of good planning to actually bring people together, which is what cities should be always about. So I wanted to say, if I had any skepticism or even cynicism about sort of these types of processes, I've been greatly sort of encouraged by what I've seen and witnessed relative to the community engagement on this project.
No, that's great, and we certainly want engagement, and that's what this show is about. It's about supporting folks like yourselves who are showing up and doing the work, but also in the course of that work, inspiring others to join on board. And I think we all believe that certainly, Hollywood Boulevard and Hollywood being in the center of the city is such a driver of economic opportunity and jobs for our region. So hopefully, as we seek to elevate the Hollywood experience for all, that means the residents, the visitors, the businesses, and all. So this has been a great conversation, and we're really excited to follow your progress simply because we know that it's a few years down the road before we're going to see this come to fruition. So we have a lot more opportunities to tune in with you both to see how this is going. But before we end, since we're a new podcast about fostering community in LA, we want to get to know you and your Los Angeles. So we want to share with our audience who you are, what you do, and a sense of your LA. So we're going to start with you first, Lee, since you're right here, 6 feet apart, of course. Where you from? Where you from originally?
I'm from Santa Barbara originally, just up the coast.
Dan, where are you from?
I grew up in southern New Jersey.
Jersey boy, okay. Which neighborhood do you live in, Dan? If you want to share that with our audience.
Sure. I live in Silver Lake.
Silver Lake. Lee?
Hollywood.
Okay. As we said with our other guests, mobility is always a topic of conversation in Los Angeles and people lamenting the traffic. So we always ask this question: Uber, Lyft, yellow cab, bike, bus, walk, metro, or scooter? How do you get around?
Walk and metro. Up until recently, I don't really go anywhere anymore. But before that, walk and metro. I obviously still have a car. Yeah.
Dan?
Yeah. I walk around my apartment. No, I do have a car, but I also lived in New York City for about 6 years, and I've lived in Silver Lake and Los Feliz, and even when I lived in North Hollywood for the first few years after I moved to LA, I have been really fortunate that I feel like I've always been, or for the most part, I've always been in an area where I can walk around, and I really, really treasure that. And I'm lucky to live in a neighborhood and have some stuff nearby that I can walk to, and I try to do that as much as I can.
Tell us your favorite restaurant or top 2 restaurants.
Luther and Frank's and Neptune's Net. That's a slam dunk.
Okay, Dan.
That is a great question. Okay, let's see. There is a wonderful, Texas-inspired breakfast taco place. There are 2 locations. One is in East Hollywood and one is in Highland Park. That is called Home State, and I am a big, big fan of that. I'm also staying true to Silver Lake. I am a really big fan of Silver Lake Ramen. And they have another, a sister location, also in Highland Park as well.
Okay. When you have a visitor from New Jersey, what's your favorite spot to take them in Los Angeles?
Well, I've been here for about 11 years, and historically, in that time, my favorite thing to do is to get in the car and Lee, don't be offended by that. But we get in the car.
I love cars, don't get me wrong.
Yeah.
I am from Los Angeles.
And we drive, I like to take them to Mulholland Drive or through the hills, because for about a year and a half, I did live in the Laurel Canyon area as well. And so I know the hills pretty well, and I know, the different routes and, good places to see different parts of the city or the valley and stuff like that. And so I like to take people through that, and generally, folks seem to really get a kick out of that because, in my experience anyway, LA. One of the things that makes LA so special is the diversity of all of the different views and vantage points and ways to look at it. Whether you're in the flats and you're within the urban core and you're looking through the buildings and up at the hills and you've got the San Gabriels behind you, or you're up in the hills and you're looking down at everything. There's just so many beautiful ways to look at it, and so I usually like to take people up there, do the Mulholland Drive.
Okay, so that's a great answer, but these are lightning round answers. So Lee, your favorite spot to take a guest visiting from Santa Barbara?
Well, okay, it depends how long they're here, but I have to name 2. One is down Hollywood Boulevard. I love walking them down Hollywood Boulevard because I just think it's so diverse. The other one is, taking a car, but starting in downtown on Sunset Boulevard and driving all the way to the beach. And the reason I like that is because you basically go through about 6 or 7 ecologies of LA. Literally an hour and a half. So if they're only here for a day, that's the first thing I do with them. And they haven't been here before. Yeah, I take them there.
Rams or Chargers? Lee?
How about neither? Sorry. Maybe if I were the Chargers, maybe. If I had to pick one, it's Chargers. I've never been a Rams fan.
Dan, Rams or Chargers?
Rams, 100%.
Lakers or Clippers? Lee?
Oh, Clippers.
Dan?
Lakers all the way, baby.
Oh my God, Dad. Let's never go to Staples. Or maybe we should.
Favorite watering hole?
Oh, well, you know mine. Come on, Dwayne. It's the Frolic Room right across the street from me.
I know that, but I shouldn't be telling your answers. Dan?
I think I'd actually go with Musso's for that one.
Okay, so I think we've got a lot of Musso and Frank fans here, and I think they will appreciate this when they reopen. So, So hopefully we can have you both on again, discuss the progress you're making, and certainly, Dan, please convey to the council member we appreciate his leadership on this project and all that he continues to do, and we certainly look forward to maybe having him on as a guest in the future. So Dan and Lee, thank you for being with us.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you to our audience for tuning in, and we hope that you enjoyed this program. Join us again next week as we look forward to another great conversation. Until we meet again, get involved, become engaged, participate. Thank you all. To learn more about Civitas LA and share feedback on this program or recommend future programs, please visit our website at www.civitasla.com. and we hope you'll connect with us on social media so we can continue the conversation on Facebook or Twitter.